Okay, so let's go ahead and get started, and we'll start by introducing all of tonight's hostesses that are here. So my name is Nicole Bennett, and I blog at gidgetgoeshome.com. And welcome.
Hi, I'm Haley Stewart, and I blog at Carrots for Michaelmas. And I love Jane, and Mansfield Park's one of my favorite books, so I'm excited to talk about it with y'all.
Hey, I'm Melissa. I blog at melissacamrewilkins.com.
I'm Jessica Howard. I blog at quirkybookworm.com. And I have to admit, this is not my favorite Jane Austen, but I think it should be a good discussion.
I think a lot of us might share that opinion. So, and I also just want to give a shout out to LitFuse Publicity, and they are producing our video and here helping us, and they are provided the books that we're going to give away tonight. So we're really thankful for them. We might have a couple other of the moderators hop on later, so if they join us, we'll introduce them to you. But we're going to get started by talking about something that came up a lot last time in our Pride and Prejudice discussion, as we talked about really bad mother figures. And so in Mansfield Park, it's kind of a toss-up between who's the worst mother figure. So we've got Lady Bertram and Mrs. Norris and even Mrs. Price to consider. So what do you guys think? Who's the worst mother we've got here?
I think Mrs. Norris. Because, I mean, they all are pretty negative mother figures, but Mrs. Norris is, like, actively awful, if that makes sense. Whereas Lady Bertram, the flaw is that she's so uninvolved and really neglectful. And Mrs. Price has her own things going on, but Aunt Norris seems to be actively promoting vice in those under her care. But I'm interested to hear what other people think.
I think exactly the same thing. I think she's just vicious to poor Fanny, and she's not helping anybody. You know, there's no redeeming anything about poor Mrs. Norris. She gets no redeeming character qualities.
Unless you count her, connection between Mariah and Mr. Rushworth, which I don't think really counts, but that's what she would say.
Well, I think it's just funny that she's so opposite of her two sisters, because I think you guys are right that, like, Mrs. Price and Lady Bertram are both kind of indolent and neglectful, and then Mrs. Norris, I would agree, probably is the worst, just because she's so interfering, and playing favorites is just never, it always messes things up, but I don't know, I'm curious as to how they ended up that way with her so different from the other two.
Well, we see that a lot, I feel like, in Austen families, that there are these like really good, virtuous characters and these really terrible characters and the same, siblings. So it seems like something that she is interested in, developing in her characters.
And children in the same family with wildly different temperaments. I think that comes up a lot too.
And I think it's interesting that by the end of the book, I almost kind of thought Lady Bertram was sweet. And you really see her affection for Fanny as you go along in the book, and how she appreciates her when she's not there. And, I mean, it's still a weird relationship, and she's a weird mother, but, she just does nothing.
Well, her pugs.
Oh, right. How could I forget?
Well, although she had the money, I wonder if she would have been more like Aunt Norris or more like Mrs. Price if she didn't have money, because she couldn't have afforded to be that lazy, but I don't know.
That is interesting, because didn't it say something about Mrs. Price that she would have done well, like in a situation like Lady Bertram?
Yeah.
But that wasn't her lot in life. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. All right, any other thoughts on bad mothers in the story?
Well, one thing about Aunt Norris is it seems that for some reason Lady Bertram just isn't capable of mothering the way she should. And so Aunt Norris steps in. And Sir Thomas, I think, really intends to be a good father, but it's almost like Aunt Norris just cuts him off, and because she wants to be the one doing everything, it makes him be less involved and take a back seat, which turns out to be really negative later. So I think that also Aunt Norris kind of cuts them off from their father as well as their mother.
Yeah, and she almost just like wants all the credit but doesn't want to do the hard work. You know, when she had the opportunity to adopt Fanny and take her in as her own, since she didn't have any of her own children, you know, she didn't want the hard work that was involved there. She just wanted to claim the credit for Julia and Mariah being so, you know, beautiful and popular socially, and, you know, being the one that connected her, Mariah, with Mr. Rushworth, and so she wanted all that credit, but she didn't want to take any of the hard work that might not give credit to her later.
Yeah, it seemed like this weird martyr complex, but it's always about her.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really about the other people. What was it later? When I think it's when the oldest son, Tom, right, is sick, and at the part there's some point where there's nothing for Mrs. Norris to do, and she's really angry about it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember at what point, but she's really upset because there's not like any busy work that she can do to feel good about herself.
Yeah, that happens at the ball, and like the cooks have already taken care of everything, and she's like mad because she wanted to like set the menu or whatever. She wants the credit, I think. Again. Yeah. Good. Well, we're all in agreement. Boo on Aunt Norris. Well, let's jump ahead to Fanny, and when she refuses Henry Crawford, and I think we can all agree that that was the right choice. We all knew enough about Henry to know that he was not as virtuous as he tried to make himself out to be to Fanny. But what do you guys think about how that all played out, her rejecting the proposal, and how the family received that, and how it, you know, played out with the character that Jane Austen was developing for us with Fanny? So what do you guys think about that whole thing?
I think it was pretty out of character. I mean, for her to stand up to her uncle that way, and for her to stand up to someone like Henry, who was like higher in society than her, and I don't know, I mean, it makes sense in terms of she knew she and Henry wouldn't be a good match, but I'm a little bit surprised that she had the gumption to stand up for herself that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was in character. I think it was obviously really difficult for her temperament because I think she's naturally more timid. But I think we saw her kind of standing up for what she thought was right earlier with the play when everyone is involved in this and they say, oh, why don't you take this part? And it's really difficult for her to say, no, I really can't. I don't want anything to do with this. But she's able to do it. She's able to stand up and say, I don't think this is right and I don't want to, even though for someone with her temperament, it would be much, much harder for her than, say, for Elizabeth Bennet to speak up. It wouldn't be hard for Elizabeth. So I think there is a lot of inner strength, even though her personality is so completely different from other Austen heroines.
Yeah, if you put it in the perspective of the play, that's true. Like, I hadn't really thought about that, but I guess she does. When it comes down to it, she can put her foot down. It's the last resort.
Right.
Yeah, and then there's something interesting about how she doesn't, you know, reveal why she's actually not going to accept his proposal. And there was quite a bit of talk in various threads about her silence, you know, how that makes a statement, you know, and she did have that propriety of not wanting to reveal the impropriety of her cousins, with Henry until it's like absolutely necessary when she tells Edmund later. But I think that just reveals a little bit more about that strong, silent, part of her character that she just only says as much as she needs to, as much as barely what's necessary.
It reminds me a little bit, that part of in Pride and Prejudice, when Elizabeth has so much guilt over Lydia going away with Wickham because she knew what Wickham was and didn't tell. And I was surprised that Fanny just has none of that guilt. She doesn't feel like she should have let anybody in on who Henry was. I think that's a lot of my frustration with Fanny as a character. Like, I totally identify with her being an introvert and highly sensitive and all of that, but she could have, though it would have been hard for her and especially jeopardized her position at Mansfield Park, she could have let people in on what she had seen when they were at the Rushworth estate early on or after the play. And she kind of keeps it all to herself and doesn't even feel any of that remorse that Elizabeth shows in Pride and Prejudice. And I was kind of surprised by that.
That's a great point.
Really interesting, yeah.
Because surely she could have at least told Edmund.
Mm-hmm.
I can see her, obviously, I wouldn't want to tell,
Sir Thomas
anything like that, but
No.
I feel like she could at least have confided in Edmund. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, because I hadn't made the connection, but it is a really similar situation to what happened with Wickham and Lydia, what ended up happening with Mariah and Henry later. It's totally the same thing. So it's really interesting that she went down a similar plot line, but then had the characters totally react differently.
Well, and there was a much less happy ending, right? I mean, I don't know if you can call Lydia and Wickham's marriage happy, but...
True, yeah.
I think it's Lydia and Wickham are kind of a Aunt Norris and Mariah and their little cottage kind of situation where it's their own punishment.
Totally. Well, let's talk about, since we're talking about Fanny's character and whether we like her or not, I think that some of you may have read Haley's post on why she loves Fanny, and that really kind of won me over. The more I read and thought about it, I was like, okay, she has a lot of redeeming qualities. She's just kind of boring, but I really do actually like her, and I could see where I think I commented on that post that I would love her as a friend for my daughter, that type of a person. So what do you guys think about Fanny as a character, as a heroine? It's hard not to compare her to the other Pride and Prejudice heroines, but either in comparison or just as a standalone, female character. What do you think?
Well, I think, obviously, nobody's going to compare with Elizabeth Bennet, right? Or Eleanor Dashwood, But I think, if you look at the more minor Austen, I guess I'd probably rather hang out with Fanny Price than Emma Woodhouse, because Emma's just crazy. So, I don't love Fanny, but I can see where she does have some redeeming qualities, and at least, she errs on the side of caution and boringness, not the side of, craziness, which I can't really deal with. So.
Someone commented on the post I wrote saying, because I talked a little bit about how she's an introverted heroine, and that's kind of different for us because we're used to outgoing heroines, and so an introverted one feels boring to us as readers because we're not used to that. And someone was mentioning, well, Anne Elliot is an introvert. And Eleanor Dashwood's probably definitely an introvert, but we don't find them boring. So what is it about Fanny that's a little boring? And it's undeniable. She is a little bit boring. But I think maybe Austen wants us to think about, why is that? What is it we're looking for in people? What is it we're looking for in friendships? And what makes people valuable friends? And maybe sometimes we're not looking for the right things. But it'll be fun to compare later when we talk about Eleanor and Anne Elliot. It'll be fun to compare them to Fanny, and I'm going to talk about that down the road.
I think one thing that makes it easier for us to identify with Eleanor or with Anne is that they do have a close female friend that can be sort of their confidant, and we can kind of identify with them through that relationship. And we just don't have that with Fanny. She's got Edmund, sort of, but there's all this stuff that she can't talk about with Edmund through the whole novel. I think that makes it a little bit harder for us to relate to her compared to the other.
That's a great point. Someone else said that it was hard for them to read about Fanny because it's so loud in her head. Like she's always like talking. We're hearing all her thoughts, which is kind of frustrating for the readers. So I think that's a great point about she doesn't have a friend to kind of get this all out and discuss in real dialogue. And so I think that's
like if her sister Susan had been there all along, maybe, I wonder. Might have been a very different book.
Yeah, there's a lot of narration. Maybe compare. I'd have to set the book side by side, but it seems like there's maybe more dialogue in Pride and Prejudice than in Mansfield Park. Interesting. Okay, so maybe some of us kind of grew in our love for Fanny over the course of the book, but what about Edmund as the hero? Haley, you mentioned in one of the threads on the Facebook group that you actually started to like him less.
I feel like every time I read it, I dislike him more, or like him less. I don't know if I can say dislike, but in comparison to Fanny's inner strength, despite her timid temperament, he comes off kind of weak. Like he seems easily manipulated, then kind of hypocritical with the play, where at first he's so scandalized and so against it, and then, well, Mary needs someone to play the opposite part. It just seems, it's a complicated situation, but it seems that he's able to kind of lie to himself about a lot of different things, about Mary, about his behavior, and at the end, it's almost like, well, I really wish I could have married Mary, and she was the person that I thought she was when I was in love with her. But, well, there's Fanny. She's still around. And it just seems kind of anticlimactic.
Yes.
Maybe that's why Austen didn't, go into detail about exactly what their proposal looked like, because it was just so anticlimactic that you're like, oh, and then that happened. So I felt... I saw a few people discussing, wouldn't it have been more fun if Henry was reformed and she got to marry him because he's a lot more charming? But, that has a bunch of problems on its own. But I just can't like Edmund as much anymore. He doesn't seem equal to Fanny.
Yeah, it is a weird ending. It's just, up until so close to the end, he's still pining after Mary and thinking he'll never get over her, and then Austen just kind of summarizes, he had this change of heart, and as long as it took, he's not going to tell us how long, but it's a weird thing. And it's funny, when I was rereading back over the questions and I saw that one, I listened to the last half of the book on the LibriVox recording audiobook, and it's a dramatized recording, which was really great because it helps you keep straight who's talking, and it gives a little more personality to the characters. But oh my goodness, the voice of Edmund was awful. It was this nasally, weak sounding. I mean, maybe it was good in the sense, maybe it's portraying who he really is in that sense, but it wasn't a charming voice. Henry Crawford's voice was much more appealing, so that kind of makes sense because he's kind of that charismatic extrovert. But I just couldn't get past, this is supposed to be the hero's voice, and I think part of it was, this is a free recording, and his voice maybe is a little just less clearly recorded. Maybe that's part of it, but part of it is just the voice. I just couldn't get into his voice as being this, heartthrob when you think of, Darcy, or Mr. Knightley even, so I don't know. It's just kind of a funny connection I made between not really liking him as much as a hero should be, and then his voice kind of backing that up.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Mandy in the comments had a really good question about, would Fanny have been considered boring at the time the book was published? And I know Anne Marie, who was in the group, was sharing that at the time that sort of heroine was much more popular than like the Elizabeth Bennet kind of heroine. So I think it's definitely possible that readers at that time would have been a lot more comfortable with Fanny and able to accept her as a heroine. I think that's an interesting question. What do y'all think?
I think, oh shoot, where did I think it was in the History Chicks podcast about, they did one on Jane Austen's life, and then they did a couple of follow-up, like, book club podcasts where they go through each of her books. And I think they were saying that at the time, Mansfield Park sold better. Oh, man, I should have looked this up ahead of time. But anyway, because of that, because in society, like, Fanny Price was the kind of model that mothers would say, you should be like this to their daughters, and so they would let their daughters read that book, versus like they didn't want an Elizabeth Bennet as a daughter kind of a thing. So I don't know, it might have been somewhere else. But anyway, even if it's not in the History of Chicks podcast, the podcast is really good if you want more Jane Austen details. So.
I've read that also, that Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park were her two almost equally most popular books in her lifetime, that was Fanny and Elizabeth were her two beloved heroines.
Weird.
Contemporarily.
So do you think that Edmund would have been a more popular hero in that time and than he is now? I mean, I wonder if that just plays on our need for entertainment and, exciting, heart-throbbing romance and strong heroines and heroes. So I wonder if also he would have been more well-liked. I don't know.
He would have been a huge catch, right? Because he was A, rich, and B, attractive, and C, very kind, which, I mean, to get all three of those in one guy, like, so maybe he was dull, but hey, in that era, it probably didn't matter as much.
I think heroes were held to a less high standard than the heroines, just reflecting social mores for one thing, but really, in terms of marriageability, it was much more about what he brought to the table. Like Jessica was saying about his fortune and his career prospects and all of that.
I think in a lot of like modern romantic comedies, there's this misguided idea that the Henry Crawford sort of character can just suddenly be reformed, and like the bad boy kind of character likes the nice girl, and it all does work out, even though you're wondering, how is this going to work out? He was just formerly horrible. So I think we're used to characters like that. And so...
It's funny now that you say that, Haley, but Edmund totally is like the guy who doesn't get the girl in a romantic comedy normally.
Uh-huh.
Now that you say that, I can see it. So, but then he does get the girl. It's like a twist.
But not the girl who wanted. Yeah, the second girl.
Edmund is, sorry. He's like the best friend, She's like in love with him the whole time, and that doesn't always work out. So it's kind of interesting to see that does work out, where the two that were just friends and cousins, even that's normal, but for them. But and then they actually end up together. To me, that's kind of a surprising thing, at least for more modern day tales. Let's move on to talk a little bit more about, we mentioned a little bit about Sir Thomas earlier when we were talking about the bad mothers, but let's talk a little bit about his parenting style, because he's definitely an involved parent to a certain degree in the story, more than Lady Bertram, the mother of some of the children, and but like you said before, sometimes cut off by the aunt who wants to jump in and take control. So let's just kind of open discussion about Sir Thomas's parenting and what you thought maybe over the course of the novel or at certain points.
I think maybe she even uses the word oppressive, like his presence is kind of oppressive, and even even Fanny feels relieved when he leaves, and she's kind of a by-the-book sort of girl, so if, like, she's relieved when he leaves, it seems that it was very kind of an oppressive environment, and his children didn't feel like they could be themselves around him. It seems like they kept holding back because they were concerned about his displeasure, and that meant that he couldn't really know them and know where they were as in terms of developing virtue and what sort of people they would become.
No, I mean, I think he just didn't know his own children very well at all, which I know in the era they were like mostly the boys would be off at school and the girls were raised by governesses and whatever, but it's still just crazy to me to think about how unaware he was. Like, he had no idea of Mariah's tendencies or Tom's tendencies, you know, and it's crazy to me to be that oblivious as a parent.
I wonder how much Austen intended him to be sort of representative of the power structures of the time. He's what we have. He's the patriarch of the family, and also just sort of representative of patriarchy in general. And even when he's making good choices, he's not able to really change the structures that they're all within. That, you know, he does go to Mariah and say, you know, are you sure you want to marry this guy? But he's so willing to hear her say, oh yeah, no, it's all good, without really digging into, like, well, what does it mean if it's not good? What do we do instead? Where do we go from here? He's just, you know, doing the best he can within the structures that there are without wanting to change anything.
And Mr. Bennet, you go ahead, Nicole.
Oh, well, it's funny that you mentioned Mr. Bennet because I was thinking of him too. But I was just going to say it's interesting how we see a shift in Sir Thomas with the way he is with Fanny. You know, it's suddenly like he becomes affectionate to her after his trip and later on. But it sounds like he was never like that before. You know, she had that fear of him. She had that kind of feeling that something was always missing, the affection, and so it's interesting how that maybe that trip and the time away changes him, and maybe when he gets back he realizes to a certain degree that she has more virtue than his own daughters. I don't know, but it's interesting the way his behavior towards her changes.
And I was thinking about Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet's relationship, and we talked last time about how he is kind of a neglectful father and isn't involved in his children's lives, especially the younger ones. But when Elizabeth tells him that she wants to marry Darcy, or he's just talked to Darcy, yeah. Darcy's just asked him, and he says, are you sure you want to marry this guy? It's like they have this rapport already. They do have some kind of relationship where she feels like she can speak honestly to him, and he can really know that she's being authentic with him. And I don't think that Sir Thomas and Mariah have that kind of relationship at all.
Yeah, I was thinking the same exact thing. I was thinking of that conversation when Mr. Bennet says, wait a minute, I thought you hated me. You know, and she's like, no, I really love him. And they have that connection and that understanding. Granted, he only has that with her, not with the other daughters, and he had made the same errors as kind of like Sir Thomas did with his two daughters, with Lydia and Kitty, not really catching on to who they really were. But I do love that scene in Pride and Prejudice where he says, you don't really have to marry him if, you don't love him.
And she does kind of have to convince him. You know, he kind of is like, are you really? And, she has to convince him that Darcy is a worthy partner for herself. Whereas Sir Thomas is just willing to hear the easy yes and, keep rolling forward.
Yeah, he's like, oh, it's a good match. Okay, well, good. We'll go with it.
Heather in the comments is saying that he seemed to be good about rules, but not teaching them about what was behind those rules, like what virtues they needed to have that were internal. It seemed like he was very external, like his daughters needed to be elegant and enter a room with grace, and this is how a lady acts, without saying, faithfulness to your spouse is a virtue, and all these things that vanity is a vice, and there's reasons behind this, and he doesn't seem to be able to be involved in a way that he can do that. And Aunt Norris doesn't have those virtues, so she can't share them with anyone. So I think that was a good point, that he seems rigid with rules, but not really able to express or to communicate to his kids in a way that they can take as their own the virtues that he cares about.
I can't remember, do we know anything about the governess that the girls would have had? Other than, I feel like she's mentioned just as far as like teaching them in the East Room, or the teacher.
I think it was something about Aunt Norris kept interfering. I mean, of course, right? But
makes sense.
I think there was just some brief reference to the governess and Aunt Norris interfering in what she was teaching, but I don't know. Full confession, I read it about 6 months ago, and it was a slog, so I wasn't going to reread it this month. So it's a little rusty.
All right. Totally understandable.
It was like twice in 1 year. I can't do it.
No way.
It's a long book.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wonder, how much in that time, like how much influence would a really engaged father have on instilling those virtues in their children, especially in that, in their status financially, in the fact that they did probably have a governess who was with the girls most of the time, and were the boys sent off to school? I can't remember if we know that or not.
I think so.
So it's a very hands-off kind of parenting for the wealthier families. So it kind of makes sense that he would not understand his children all the way, maybe, and not be able to really gauge what's going on in their heart. Whereas even in Pride and Prejudice, we know that, they didn't have a governess. And so even though their father definitely had a favorite, he should have known more what the other two were like. And he was able to connect and understand Elizabeth more because he probably had more connection and influence, throughout their lives as children. Although we see Mr. Price, not at all really connecting with his children. He came in, read his newspaper, that was about it.
Looked at boats with his friend.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts on Sir Thomas' parenting?
I see him as being really interested in position. Like when they're considering taking Fanny as a child, that's really his only concern. It's not so much about how will she behave or how will we take care of her. It's just, will she know her place in comparison to the other kids, and will his children continue to know their proper place? And I think when he's so focused on that, on the social order and on everyone knowing their place, it's really easy to overlook all of the virtue that's missing in his girls, because they can be proper without, on the surface, without actually being good people.
That whole thing is really interesting, welcoming her in, but not really taking her as a daughter, and, having her know her place. I mean, we adopted one of our children, so it's kind of hard for me to fathom, like, that he would be treated any differently. And granted, he was a baby when we brought him, but I know other families that have adopted older children, or think if, like, parents die and, an aunt and uncle take their children in, I would hope that they would treat them like their own children and not like, oh, you're my, niece from a poor home, so, you don't deserve to be treated the same as a child. So, I mean, I'm sure part of that's just part of the culture and the time, but it's a really interesting dynamic, that whole bringing her in but not bringing her all the way in.
And I think it does Fanny a disservice, because, I mean, I'm sure part of it was he didn't want to have to provide a dowry for Fanny and that sort of thing, because daughters were expensive. But, like, I can't imagine, like, bringing her in, giving her the better education, getting her used to this, like, more luxurious life, Then be like, oh, by the way, now you get to go back to your family. I don't know, like, were they going to send Fanny back at some point? Or it's just kind of a weird thing to do without maybe fully thinking through all the consequences.
Yeah. Once in the comments, Anne Marie provided the quote from the end of the book. It says, "Wretchedly did Sir Thomas feel that with all the cost and care of an anxious and expensive education, he had brought up his daughters without their understanding their first duties or his being acquainted with their character and temper." Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Heather in the comments also noted the same thing, that it is like a sign of regret that we see he's finally realizing, how he screwed up as a parent.
I don't know that Aunt Norris ever has that much self-awareness.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that's kind of a redeeming quality with Sir Thomas that we see at the end, that he regrets that he didn't get, teach them the virtues and get to know their character more and develop that more. So, yay.
At least one redeeming quality in at least one of the parental figures.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, we see a little bit of that, I think, with Lady Bertram, too, how we see in the end how much she really loves and appreciates Fanny, and then really takes Susan in under her wing to be her companion after Fanny gets married. So I thought that was pretty sweet.
It's funny, it seems that Lady Bertram and Aunt Norris both are very self-centered, but for Lady Bertram, it's kind of inward on itself. Like, she sits on her couch and does her embroidery with her dog. But with Aunt Norris, it's all her actions are all very selfish, but they're all directed at other people. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of the same flaw, but it's carried out differently.
Yeah, and maybe you could say it's a sisterly trait. I mean, maybe that's what causes Mrs. Price to not really care, if you will, that one or two of her daughters are gone, because that's less mouths she has to feed, or she gets to dote on Betsy, I think that's her name, and her sons more, and not have to worry about those daughters she doesn't care about that much. Well, as we're talking about how it kind of wraps up with those parental figures at the end, it just kind of makes us think about our own parenting and how we think about our ideals growing or changing over time. I don't know, what are any other thoughts you guys have about the end of the book and how the parental figures kind of, some seem to get their comeuppance, some just, we seem to see a little bit of a redemption in them. And then any thoughts you have on your own parenting experiences based on that?
It seemed to me that in the end we see some of the parents getting better, like Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram get a little redeemed. And the ones, those two who do, it seems like it is a result of how they learn to see properly about their own kids and about Fanny. They learn to understand what's going on, whereas the Prices don't ever gain an understanding, and their circumstances don't change either. And Mrs. Norris refuses to her estimation of Fanny or of Mariah, and she gets, sent away, off to Siberia. And so it just seemed to me like their biggest change came as a result of their kids, of things that their kids did and how they learned to understand their kids or not. And I wonder what you guys thought of that. Do you see yourself changing more as a parent in relation to your kids versus just growing as a person apart from that? Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I'm not sure what my answer would be. I mean, I think I would hope that I see my children clearly, not like the way the Bertrams were so blinded to what was actually going on in their kids' lives or what their kids' characters really were, or like Aunt Nora's kind of partiality. But I don't know. I mean, maybe it's because my kids are little, though. Like, I have an almost 4-year-old and a baby, so it's not, I mean, at this point, I don't know that their character is influencing me much, but it might be different if I had older kids.
Yeah, one practical way I think that's played out for me is I started kind of trying to study up on personality and personality in my kids. And I'm kind of just getting into that with my daughter being only almost 7, and then my son just turned 4, but it's still, questionable whether I can, figure out really what his personality type is, or, certain things show up at an early age, like my daughter's extroversion was very apparent from an early age. But just as I've started to pin down, okay, this is how she's wired, and I just kind of see like certain, parts of her character and how she was made, then I can adjust my parenting in a way, kind of as we go along. Like, okay, I'm seeing, this play out, but it's not that she's just doing this to make me mad. It's just that that's how her mind works, and that's how she likes to do things or whatever. So it just can make for more conversations we can have, because I can try to get to understand who she is. And I think as they grow up, I think even, at the age of your kids, Jessica, it's still really hard, well, especially the baby. But even the 3, 4, it's still like those, they're toddlers in a way still, but the more we see who they are emerge, then we can kind of adjust, I think, for sure.
And I think for a lot of people, definitely for me, parenting does bring a lot more clarity to understanding myself and my own flaws, and just gives a lot clearer vision about who I am and where I struggle, because parenting brings all that to the surface because it really pushes you in ways you've never been pushed before.
Yeah, I find that too, and I wonder if that's what was missing. None of the parental figures in Mansfield Park had that experience. None of them really dug into parenting in those younger years to have that experience of being changed by the hard work of being in relationship with very small people, and all that goes into that. I think they all just miss that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Any other thoughts on parenting after reading this? Motherhood?
I mean, as tiring as it is sometimes, it'd be great to have a nursemaid, to get up in the night with the baby. But I do think I'm glad that, like, society has changed so much and that parenting is so much more hands-on these days, because just reading the book and reading how little the parents knew each other, or the parents knew the kids and the kids knew the parents, and, and, like, that Mrs. Price could just send William and Fanny and Susan and whoever off and not really care, and it's just kind of crazy to me. And so I'm glad that, like, for me it'd be hard to send a kid away, so I'm glad that has changed in the past few centuries.
Yeah.
I love how in this book, but in all of Austen, it seems like how close the parents and kids are just isn't related to economics. It's not the case that having more money makes for an easier parenting experience in Austen, and that's kind of it's kind of comforting, because none of us have Mansfield Park. None of us are living that life, so it's nice to think that we can be we're more like the Dashwoods or or something else.
Yeah, I think is it that Jane Austen education? Doesn't he talk about, like, the theme he learns in Mansfield Park has to do with the richer people having more money, more problems, kind of thing, I can't remember exactly, and I think somebody mentioned that in the Facebook group, that he talks about that in that book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of my favorite little discussions that someone brought up was just how Fanny Price, she said, Fanny Price would not enjoy my home. We have banging and hallooing and clatters, especially hallooing. There's lots of that. And just thinking about the difference even between Mansfield Park and Portsmouth, and just, the quiet, solemn tone of life in Mansfield Park versus, and maybe that's also because the kids are all grown up in that home, whereas at family's home, there's still a lot of young kids running around, but just how it grates on her. It's just, I think a lot of us in the group have young children, and so I think we all have a lot of hallooing going on in our homes. So I just thought that was kind of a funny comment that we can maybe relate to.
Absolutely.
Lots of hallooing. I was surprised that Fanny didn't try to calm the hallooing in any way.
Yeah.
I thought she would have for sure tried to step in and bring some order there, and not so much. But yeah. No, we all just live with the hallooing, I think.
She was just like very inwardly focused during that time, I feel like. And
With her letters.
yes.
Letters.
Yes. Well, any other thoughts on Mansfield Park as we wrap up our discussion?
Absolutely. I was just looking at the comments, and someone commented, Lindsay commented, is anyone really the hero in this book? And and then Anne-Marie commented in response, I don't think hero is the right word. I think Fanny prefers the least amount of change, and Edmund fits that. It's a life she loves more than a person, which I think maybe it makes a lot of sense, but maybe it explains why I had a hard time relating to this book, because I think I just didn't really identify with any of the characters. And I know, Haley, you said you like Fanny, but I mean, did any of you identify with any of the characters really? Like, I had a hard time. My brain does not work the way Fanny's brain works, you know? And so it just...
Mine neither. And I don't identify with her. I feel like I identify more with Mary, and it terrifies me because I feel like that is what my personality could be, because I am definitely like a people pleaser personality, and I feel like reading Mary, like, oh, she's so fun, like she's so likable, and then you realize, oh, she's completely awful. And so I feel like it's good. I love reading the book because I feel like it's like a cautionary tale for people with my personality. So if I were to identify with anyone, it would probably be Mary. But I guess that's what I love about Austen, is she's able to kind of like shine a flashlight on everyone's soul, everyone who's reading.
Yeah, I know we didn't even really discuss Mary or the play. I mean, there's so much more we could have discussed. But one thing that I think is interesting, and I can't remember if I read it in a Jane Austen education or somewhere else, but someone pointed out that it's the only book where the title of the book is a place, and how the place, Mansfield Park, is really a main character in the novel. And it's really, it really does play a role differently than homes and places do in other novels by Jane.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I think that was in a Jane Austen education.
Yeah.
But isn't Northanger Abbey a place?
Oh, shoot. You're right.
I mean, I agree that Mansfield Park is a character, sort of, but...
And Northanger is too, but it's not Catherine's home.
Yeah, okay, that's true.
Okay, there you go. So it's the only family home that's the title of a novel. So, any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Kind of curious as to what kind of mother Fanny will be, I guess.
Yeah, that's always
the children of Fanny and Edmund.
To ask. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel nervous for her.
I say, especially if some of those recessive, Aunt Norris genes come out or something, she could be.
Nah, Fanny won't be like that.
I think she'll be great once they're reading. Yeah. Educatable age, but when they're little and they're loud, and yeah, I just hope she has a governess when they're really small.
Yeah.
But there's lots of room to stroll the grounds,
Yeah, hopefully Edmund will take them out riding or something. Yeah. Well, great. Well, I'll go ahead and announce our winners. So the book that you're going to win is by Sarah Ladd, and it's called The Headmistress of Rosemare, and it's a Regency-era novel. So our winners are Anne-Marie Lindsay, Mandy R., and Lindsay Glasheen Crawford. Are you related to Mary and Henry by any chance? So you can go ahead and email Caitlin at litfusegroup.com, and she'll post that in the comments of our chat on YouTube, and then I'll also post that in the Facebook group just to make sure you have it. You just need to email her and tell her you're the winner. And this chat was recorded, so we will have it available after a few days. We'll get it edited. And unfortunately, the comments will not remain, so if you want to read through those before we finish, because there's some interesting thoughts and discussion points there in the comments. And thank you to everybody who joined us and to everybody who will watch later. We're glad to have you in the book club. And we'll be starting Persuasion next. So Persuasion is one of those that I've read a long time ago. I don't really remember anything about off the top of my head, so I'm excited to jump in. And we'll see you on the Facebook group for more discussions over the next 2 months, and then we'll wrap up with our third chat probably in early June. So thanks for joining us. Have a good night.